He bought his late neighbor's old house, hoping to simply wait out the hard times. But what he found behind the wooden wall turned out to be connected to a secret that the whole neighborhood had kept quiet about. Subscribe so you don't miss the continuation, and write in the comments which city you are watching from. By the time Daniel Harper decided to leave the city, his life had been reduced to numbers he could no longer control. Numbers on overdue notices, numbers in his bank account that shrank no matter how carefully he planned, numbers on loan statements that followed him like a second shadow. At 47, he felt older than his years, worn down not by physical labor, but by the constant pressure of failing expectations. Once, he had owned a small but respectable contracting business. He had been good at it, careful, reliable. But one delayed payment led to another. Then a client went bankrupt. Then a loan meant to bridge a short gap turned into a chain around his neck. When his marriage ended soon after, the house they had shared was sold to cover debts, and Daniel found himself sleeping in a rented room that never quite felt like his own. The city, which had once promised opportunity, began to feel hostile. Every street reminded him of something he had lost. Every morning started with the same dull anxiety, a tightness in his chest that never fully eased. He stopped answering unknown numbers. He avoided opening mail. The noise, the crowds, the endless movement made him feel as though he were being pushed forward without any say in the direction. What he wanted, more than money or success, was silence, a place where time moved more slowly, where the world did not demand answers every hour. That was how he came across the listing. It was buried among dozens of others, barely noticeable. A wooden house on the edge of a small rural settlement, described in a single indifferent paragraph. Old structure, needs repairs, sold as is. The price was so low that Daniel assumed there had to be a catch. Yet something about it lingered in his mind, long after he closed the page. That night, for the first time in weeks, he slept without dreaming. 2 days later, he drove out to see it. The road narrowed as he left the main highway, asphalt giving way to cracked pavement and then gravel. Fields stretched on either side, dotted with fences that leaned as if tired of standing straight. The settlement itself was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The houses were old, most of them wooden, with porches that had seen better years. Nothing looked abandoned, yet nothing looked new. It was as though time had decided to rest here and simply watch. The house stood near the end of the road, partially hidden by a line of trees. Its exterior was darkened by age, the wooden boards weathered smooth by decades of wind and rain. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, not dangerously, but enough to show its years. As Daniel stepped out of his car, he was struck by the smell of old wood and earth, a scent that carried no hint of decay, only endurance. The man who met him there introduced himself as Mark. He was in his late 20s, perhaps early 30s, dressed neatly but without warmth. His manner was polite, distant. He explained that the house had belonged to his grandmother, who had died several months earlier. There was no emotion in his voice when he said it, only a sense of obligation, as if he were reciting information from a form. "She lived here alone for a long time," Mark said, unlocking the front door. "I don't need the place, don't have the time or money to deal with it." Daniel stepped inside and felt the air shift around him. The house was cool, but not cold. The floorboards creaked softly beneath his weight, not in protest, but in acknowledgement. Sunlight filtered through the windows in narrow beams, illuminating dust that hung suspended like something carefully arranged. They walked through the rooms in silence. The kitchen was small but sturdy, its cabinets worn smooth by hands that had opened and closed them for years. The living room held a single armchair and a bookshelf that was now empty. Upstairs, the bedrooms were modest, their walls marked by the faint outlines of pictures that had once hung there. Daniel noticed that Mark avoided one corner of the house entirely, never stepping into a narrow hallway near the back. When Daniel glanced toward it, Mark cleared his throat and suggested they return downstairs. "The price is firm," Mark said once they stood on the porch again. "Honestly, I'd rather be done with it." Daniel hesitated. Everything about the situation felt strange. The house was worth more than the asking price, even in its condition. He asked why it was so cheap. Mark shrugged. "No one wants an old place like this, and I don't want it hanging over me." That was all. The paperwork was completed the following week. Daniel transferred what little savings he had left and signed his name with a mixture of disbelief and relief. For the first time in years, something had gone his way without complication. Or so it seemed. Moving in was a quiet affair. He brought only what he needed: clothes, tools, a few books. The first night he slept on a mattress on the floor of the living room, wrapped in a blanket, listening to the house settle around him. The sounds were unfamiliar, but not frightening. Wood contracting, a faint creak from above, the whisper of wind through the trees outside. It felt like the house was breathing, slowly, deeply. The neighbors watched from a distance over the next few days. They waved when Daniel passed, offered brief greetings, but rarely lingered. When they spoke of the previous owner, they did so carefully, always respectfully, always vaguely. She kept to herself, one woman said, but she was kind. Another added, she helped people when she could. No one said more than that. Daniel spent his days repairing what he could. He replaced rotting boards, patched cracks, cleaned layers of dust from surfaces that had not been touched in years. The work was slow but satisfying. Each task completed felt like reclaiming a small piece of himself. Yet as the days passed, he began to notice odd details. Nails driven into walls where nothing had ever hung. Sections of paneling that sounded hollow when tapped. A faint smell of lavender that appeared in certain rooms and vanished in others. One afternoon, while working on the kitchen wall, he noticed that a single wooden board was slightly darker than the rest. Not enough to stand out at a glance, but enough that it caught his attention once he slowed down. When he tapped it with his knuckles, the sound was different. Dull. Empty. He hesitated, then carefully pried it loose. Behind it was a narrow cavity, just deep enough to conceal something small. Inside lay a plain, cream-colored envelope, thick and neatly sealed. It had not been shoved there hastily. It had been placed with care. Daniel held it in his hands for a long moment before opening it. Inside were several gemstones, dark and clear, wrapped in a piece of soft cloth. Even without expertise, he could tell they were valuable. Beneath them lay a folded letter, written in an unsteady but deliberate hand. The words were simple, direct. They explained nothing, yet implied everything. The writer stated that what he had found was not a gift, nor a reward. It was a responsibility, a trust. It belonged not to one person, but to many. And if he had found it, then the time had come to decide what kind of man he was. Daniel sat down heavily at the kitchen table, the envelope still open before him. His mind raced through numbers automatically. The stones could clear his debts. They could give him breathing room, a chance to start again without fear. The possibility felt almost cruel in its precision, arriving just when he had reached the edge of endurance. Yet the letter would not let him rest. Its tone was calm, almost certain, as if the woman who had written it had known exactly how this moment would unfold. As evening fell and shadows lengthened across the floor, the house seemed to grow quieter, heavier, as though it were waiting. Daniel folded the letter carefully and returned everything to the envelope. He slid it into a drawer and closed it. But the sense of having crossed an invisible line remained. The house no longer felt like a refuge alone. It felt like a witness. That night, sleep came slowly. And when it did, It carried with it the first stirrings of a story that had been waiting far longer than he had been alive. The envelope did not leave Daniel's thoughts after that night. Even when he was not actively thinking about it, its presence lingered in the back of his mind, like a weight that shifted whenever he moved. He tried to return to his routine, waking early, making simple meals, continuing the repairs he had planned, but his attention kept drifting. Every hammer strike echoed a little too loudly. Every quiet moment stretched longer than it should have. On the third day after the discovery, he drove to the nearest town under the pretense of buying supplies. In truth, he needed confirmation. Something solid. He told himself that until he knew what the stones were truly worth, there was no decision to be made. Uncertainty was a luxury he could not afford. The jeweler's shop was small and old-fashioned, tucked between a pharmacy and a bakery. The man behind the counter was careful, methodical. He examined the stones one by one beneath a magnifying glass, his expression neutral but focused. Daniel watched his hands more than his face, noting the way they slowed, the way he turned each gem with deliberate attention. "These are genuine," the jeweler finally said. "High quality, antique cut." Daniel's throat tightened. He asked what they were worth. The number, when spoken aloud, felt unreal. It was not extravagant wealth, not the kind that changed lives overnight, but it was enough. Enough to clear his debts, enough to breathe again, enough to sleep without fear. He thanked the man, paid for his supplies, and left without selling anything. The drive back felt longer than before. The fields blurred past his vision as his mind replayed the figure again and again, reshaping it into solutions. He could call the bank. He could negotiate. He could start over. The thought brought a sharp, almost painful sense of relief. Yet when he returned to the house, the relief faded. The air inside felt heavier than it had that morning. The familiar scent of old wood and faint lavender lingered in the hallway, and for the first time, it unsettled him. He stood in the kitchen for a long moment before opening the drawer and removing the envelope. The letter felt thinner than he remembered, as though it carried less weight than the stones themselves, yet its words pressed harder against him now. He read it again, slowly, this time paying attention to the phrases he had dismissed before, the careful avoidance of ownership, the emphasis on time, the suggestion that the choice mattered more than the object itself. There was no accusation in the handwriting, no demand, only certainty. That evening, Daniel sat on the porch as the sun sank behind the trees. A neighbor passed by, an older man with a weathered face and slow gait. He nodded politely, then paused. "You settling in?" the man asked. Daniel nodded. "Doing what I can." The neighbor hesitated, then added, "She'd be glad someone's taking care of the place." "She?" Daniel asked, though he already knew the answer. The man nodded. "Your seller's grandmother. Lived here longer than most of us remember." Daniel considered his words carefully. "Did you know her well?" The man exhaled softly. "Well enough. She was dependable." There was that word again. Daniel asked what he meant. The neighbor glanced toward the house, then back at Daniel. People trusted her. More than they should have, maybe. But she never broke that trust. Before Daniel could ask more, the man nodded once more and continued down the road. The conversation left behind more questions than answers, but it confirmed something Daniel had already begun to sense. The envelope was not an isolated secret. It was part of something larger. Over the following days, Daniel spoke with others. He did not ask directly at first, only listened. He learned that decades earlier, the settlement had nearly been erased. There had been a fire, though no one spoke of it in detail. Some said it was an accident. Others implied it was not. Houses had burned. Families had lost everything overnight. After that came pressure to relocate, to sell land cheaply, to move on. Some did. Others refused. It was during that time, Daniel learned, that valuables began to disappear. Documents, heirlooms, small savings passed down through generations. Not stolen, but hidden, entrusted to someone who would keep them safe until it was safe to return them. That someone had been the woman who owned his house. As the story unfolded piece by piece, Daniel began to understand the weight she had carried. She had been neither wealthy nor powerful. She had simply been steady. When fear spread through the community, she became a quiet center, a place where people could leave parts of their lives without explanation. They trusted her because they had to trust someone. But time did not restore what had been lost. The years passed, people died, families scattered, and the woman remained, holding on to things that no longer had clear owners. To some, she became strange, to others, suspicious. Yet no one confronted her openly. The silence grew thicker, heavier, until it became easier to let the past rest where it was. Daniel began to notice changes in the house as his understanding deepened. Certain rooms felt colder at night. Floorboards creaked more often, as though stirred by unseen movement. He dreamed of fire without flames, of hands passing objects through smoke. When he woke, his chest felt tight, his thoughts unsettled. At the same time, the pressure from outside intensified. Letters arrived. Calls followed. Deadlines approached with mechanical indifference. Daniel found himself standing at the kitchen table late one night, the envelope open before him, the stones catching the light. He imagined placing them back in the jeweler's hands, hearing that number spoken again, feeling the weight lift from his shoulders. He could justify it easily. No one would know. The woman was gone. The past was buried. He had not caused the losses that had led to this secrecy. He was only surviving. Yet the house resisted his reasoning. Each time he tried to settle on a decision, something disrupted him. A noise in the walls, a sudden memory of a neighbor's expression, the letter's calm insistence. He began to realize that the discomfort he felt was not fear of consequence, but fear of erasing something that had survived precisely because it had been protected for so long. One night, unable to sleep, Daniel walked through the house with a flashlight. He examined walls more closely than before, tracing seams, tapping panels. Behind a section of the hallway, he found markings etched faintly into the wood. Initials. Dates. Names he did not recognize. They were subtle, nearly invisible unless one knew to look. The house was not merely old, it was layered. Daniel returned to the kitchen and sat down heavily. The truth settled slowly but firmly. The stones were not a gift. They were a test. Not of honesty in the abstract, but of courage. Selling them would solve his immediate problems, but it would also complete the erasure that the woman had spent her life resisting. As dawn approached, the house grew quiet again. The dreams faded. The weight in Daniel's chest shifted, not lifting, but clarifying. He knew he stood at a threshold, much like the woman before him had stood decades earlier. And he understood, with a mixture of dread and resolve, that whatever choice he made next would shape not only his future, but the meaning of the house itself. When the sun finally rose, Daniel did not reach for the envelope. Instead, he poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the table, staring out the window at the slow awakening of the settlement. The decision was not yet made, but the direction was becoming unavoidable. Morning arrived without ceremony. The light crept through the windows slowly, touching the edges of the furniture before settling across the floor. Daniel sat at the kitchen table where he had remained for most of the night, his coffee long gone cold. He had not slept. Instead, he had listened to the house, as if it were speaking in a language he was only beginning to understand. The envelope lay untouched in the drawer beside him. For the first time since finding it, he did not feel pulled toward it. The urgency that had haunted him for days had transformed into something quieter and more demanding. Clarity did not bring relief, but it brought resolve. He understood now that the decision was not between poverty and comfort, nor even between right and wrong in the simplest sense. It was a decision about continuity, about whether something fragile and stubborn, something that had survived because people had believed in it, would be allowed to vanish quietly at last. The woman who had owned the house had lived with that choice every day of her life. She had carried it alone. Daniel felt the weight of that inheritance settle on his shoulders, not as a burden forced upon him, but as one he had accepted the moment he pried that board loose from the wall. The calls continued that morning. Messages filled his phone, polite at first, then firm, then edged with threat. He listened to them without responding. Each voice sounded distant, unreal, as though coming from another world entirely. The life he had been living only weeks before already felt far away. He moved through the house slowly, touching the walls, the door frames, the worn banister. The house no longer felt like a shelter from his problems. It felt like a place that demanded presence, attention, honesty. By midday, Daniel had made his decision fully. There was no dramatic moment, no sudden revelation. Only a steady certainty that refusing the easy escape was the only way he would be able to remain in this house without shame. He retrieved the envelope from the drawer and placed it carefully on the table. The stones caught the light again, brilliant and indifferent. He did not flinch this time. Instead, he folded the letter once more and placed it atop them, as though reuniting two parts that had been separated too long. What followed was not simple. Daniel began by visiting the local records office in the nearby town, spending hours combing through faded documents and handwritten ledgers. Names emerged slowly, often repeated, sometimes crossed out or amended, properties that had changed hands under pressure, families that had vanished from the census without explanation. The past was fragmented, but it was not erased entirely. Each fragment felt like a voice resurfacing after years of silence. He returned to the house each evening, exhausted but focused. He searched through its hidden spaces with new purpose, not as a man hunting for value, but as one gathering testimony. Behind loose panels and beneath floorboards, he found small bundles wrapped in cloth, letters tied with string, documents folded so many times the creases had become permanent. There were photographs, too, their edges worn soft, showing faces that stared back at him with expressions of guarded pride. He began to recognize patterns, relationships, connections between names spoken by neighbors and names written carefully decades earlier. As the collection grew, so did the gravity of what he had uncovered. This was not merely the story of one woman's quiet sacrifice. It was the story of a community that had learned to survive by trusting one another in the shadows. The house had not been a hiding place for wealth alone. It had been a refuge for truth, at a time when truth was dangerous to possess. Daniel reached out carefully to those still living who might understand. Some conversations ended quickly, fear still lingering beneath the surface, even after so many years. Others unfolded slowly, painfully. Tears were shed. Long-held assumptions were questioned. The woman who had owned the house emerged in these stories not as a mysterious recluse, but as a guardian whose silence had been misunderstood. With each retelling, her choice gained shape and meaning. When the time came to bring people together, Daniel felt a nervousness he had not known even during the worst moments of his financial collapse. He arranged a small gathering at the community hall, a building as old and weathered as the house itself. Word spread quietly. Curiosity overcame hesitation. People came not knowing exactly what to expect, only sensing that something long unresolved was about to surface. Daniel stood before them with the envelope in his hands. He spoke without embellishment, without apology. He told them how he had found it, what it contained, and what he had learned since. He read aloud portions of the letter, his voice steady though his hands trembled. As he spoke, expressions in the room shifted. Recognition flickered across faces. Names spoken aloud found their owners in the crowd. When he revealed the stones, there was a collective intake of breath, not of greed, but of memory. These were not objects of sudden fortune. They were symbols of trust deferred, of hope preserved against reason. One by one, families stepped forward as connections were made. Some had only fragments of stories passed down through generations. Others had known the truth, but had never believed it would resurface. The distribution was careful and deliberate. Nothing was rushed. Some items were returned directly to descendants. Others, whose owners could no longer be traced, were placed into the care of the community itself, entrusted to a local archive so that the story would not fracture again. The stones were divided according to records and testimony, their value acknowledged, but no longer central. What mattered was the act of return. Daniel felt the shift immediately. It was not gratitude that moved him most deeply, though there was plenty of that. It was the sense of alignment, of having chosen a path that allowed the past to breathe without demanding possession. The house, when he returned to it that evening, felt different. The air was lighter. The lavender scent had faded to a memory. The floorboards creaked as they always had, but without that undertone of tension he had grown accustomed to. Financially, his life did not transform overnight. The debts did not vanish. But something unexpected occurred. Offers of work began to arrive, small at first, then steadier. People trusted him, not because he had money, but because he had shown himself capable of holding something valuable without claiming it. The bank negotiations softened. Time was granted. Solutions emerged gradually, honestly. One evening, while completing the last of the repairs in the hallway, Daniel discovered a final note hidden behind a narrow beam. It was written in the same hand as the letter, the ink faint but legible. It did not mention wealth or sacrifice. It spoke, instead of patience, of believing that even if one was misunderstood in life, truth had a way of finding the light eventually. It ended with a simple line, expressing hope that whoever found it would understand the difference between owning and preserving. Daniel closed his eyes for a long moment, absorbing the quiet gratitude that rose within him. The woman had known. She had trusted that the house would endure, that someone would come who could finish what she had begun. In the months that followed, the house became a place of gathering rather than silence. People visited, not to claim what had once been hidden, but to remember. Stories were shared openly now, without fear. The house no longer guarded secrets. It offered them freely, having fulfilled its purpose. Daniel remained. He planted a small garden beside the porch, repaired the fence, replaced the roof one careful section at a time. The life he built there was modest, but it was his. More importantly, it was honest. He no longer felt pursued by numbers. The past had not been erased, but it had been acknowledged. And in that acknowledgement, he found a peace he had not known he was missing. On quiet evenings, as the sun dipped low and the settlement settled into stillness, Daniel would sit on the porch and listen. The house breathed around him, steady and content. He understood then that some choices, once made, reshaped everything that followed. And he knew, with certainty, that the cost of that choice could never have been measured in stones or numbers, but only in the weight it lifted from the world. If you enjoyed this story, Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Watch the next video and explore other stories on the channel. And if this story resonated with you, share it with someone who might appreciate it too.